Welcome everyone! There are so many young chess stars nowadays, and unfortunately I see more and more players from my own generation drop down the rating list. That's just life of course, but it still feels a bit sad. One of those players is Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, also known as MVL, and I recently came across a great game of his, so I felt like sharing that one. It's a very nice Sicilian game and it was played in Tata style in 2015. He played Fabiano Caruana. Fabiano had white and opened with e4, c5, knight to f3, intending some kind of open Sicilian after d4, d6. White could still shy away from an open Sicilian with bishop b5 check, but that was not Caruana's plan. After d4, cd4, knight d4, Black attacked the e-pawn. Now this means White cannot go for a Maroczy bind setup with c4, because White uses the other knight to guard the pawn, and after a6 it's the Najdorf variation. Now you may know that MVL is famous for his very narrow opening repertoire, which is rare among top players nowadays. Against d4 he'll always play the Grunfeld, and against e4 he'll always choose the Najdorf. That does of course also mean there's hardly anyone who knows more about the opening than he does, so it's not easy to out-prepare him. White here opted for h3, the main point of which is actually to go for g2, g4. MVL therefore sought to prevent that after e5 forcing away the knight. He went h5, so g4 is now off the table. g3 was played next. Another option is bishop to g5, intending to take control over the d5 square, but after bishop e6 and the trade, White does claim the d5 square, but sacrificing the bishop pair is necessary, and that's not to everyone's taste. Going back, g3 was played, then bishop to e6, bishop g2, knight from b to d7, just developing quickly, but also gaining good control of the center. And downside is that White now can grab space with a4. Black could have prevented that with b5 instead of knight to d7, but then the black pawns can become targets for White. There's an upside and downside to everything. MVL continued with bishop to e7, so now all his minor pieces coordinate very well and in control a lot of squares. White castled, rook c8, taking control of the semi-open c-file, bishop e3, knight b6. Black now has a clear plan, quickly going for central counterplay with d5. Caruana played b3. Now as I said, MVL wants to go for counterplay with d5, but in this position that would be a pawn sacrifice, because White can take the knight on b6 and then the d-pawn isn't defended enough anymore. However, sacrificing the pawn is exactly what MVL had in mind. He's actually forced to play this in some way, because otherwise White may go a4, a5 and simply drive away the knight from b6. But either way, MVL now gets the counterplay that he wants. White indeed took on b6, and then knight takes d5. Now by taking with the knight, White can also advance the c-pawn. They traded knights. The bishop retreated to d7. That is the best square for the bishop, because Black wants to advance the f-pawn later on. Now as expected, c4 was played. Queen d6 to keep the position closed, otherwise White may try to play d5, d6 at some point. Now Black is ready to play f5. a5 was played next by Caruana, that's to stop Black from going a5 and closing down the queen side. f5 as planned, and now White went for queen to d3. Maybe it was better to just improve the knight, going knight c3 for example. Here the queen will be attacked by an eventual e5, e4, and it's not clear what the queen move has done for White. h4 came first, undermining White's king position. g4, and after MVL castled, he's now ready to advance the e-pawn, and it was here that Caruana miscalculated something. He went for knight to c3. Instead, he could have traded on f5, and after queen e3 and queen to g6, just step out of the side of the queen with king to h1, and Black isn't actually threatening anything right now, and White is still a pawn up. After knight to c3, MVL just pushed the e-pawn, And after queen to e3 went bishop to d8, and white cannot stop black from lining up queen and bishop, which will be aiming at the white king side. Now it turned out that Caruana had expected queen to e5, after which f4 would be a good defense. After bishop to d8, however, f4 doesn't do anything, because black just takes the pawn en passant, rook takes, and after bishop to c7, queen h2 check is a winning threat. Now instead of f4, white saw no better move than to sack the bishop for 2 pawns, and even though white has 3 pawns for the piece, black is still much better, because 1, he has the bishop pair, and 2, he can target weaknesses in the white position. After queen to f4, they traded queens. Then f3, trying to block out the rook, bishop e7, planning bishop to b4 and doubling the rooks on the f-file, and it already looks hopeless for white because he cannot defend all the pawns. Caruana did bring the king over to help cover the f-pawn. MVL just continued with bishop to e8, now actually intending to bring the bishop to g6. However, after c5, the b5 square is suddenly very attractive, so bishop to b5, attacking the rook. White now actually didn't defend the rook, but just covered the c-pawn he just weakened with b4. White was probably hoping for bishop takes f1, but that would be a mistake because the rook is very passive and the bishop is actually really good. MVL found a far better move. He actually sacked the rook for the knight. Now the knight was white's only decent piece, so by taking that off, white has no practical chances at all. Now of course, not pawn takes, because white loses all his pieces. So king takes rook, and now the king is a sitting duck in the center of the board. Rook to e8, lining up the rook with the king. Now the king needs to step carefully now. The worst of all would be king to d4, because bishop f6 is mate. If instead king to f5, then again bishop to f6, and if white tries to trade off the rook with rook from a to e1, then bishop d3 check, and white has to interpose with the rook and lose more material to survive, because king to f4 runs into g5 checkmate. And if lastly rook from f to e1, this also fails tactically due to bishop takes pawn check, and after king to f5, rook f8 check and king to g5, white drops another pawn and it's time to resign. Going back, Caruana opted for king to f4, but the king still got cornered after g5 check, king to f5 and king to f7, taking away the king's escape squares but also preparing bishop to f6 to close the mating net. White tried rook from f to e1, but after bishop d3 check, rook e4 is the only move, because if king to e5, then after bishop takes c5, it's a very neat checkmate. So rook to e4, but after MVL played bishop to f6, planning rook e5 checkmate, Caruana resigned anyway. Once again, the Najdorf did not let MVL down. I really liked that pawn sacrifice with d5 on move 13, which not only gave him the bishop pair but also a lot of activity. But later on he also showed that it can be very practical to sacrifice some material back, eliminating all possible counterplay, and just wrap up the game very smoothly. Well, hopefully you also enjoyed the game. If you did, you would make my day if you'd simply like the video and subscribed. More great games are coming up. See you again soon and take care.